The platform was nothing more than 3 planks of lumber nailed together over frozen mud, but it felt like a gallows. Abigail Mercer stood on it with her back straight and her hands folded in front of her because that was the only dignity she had left, and she was not going to let them take that too. The wind off the mountain came down hard through the gap between the feed store and the post office, cutting through the wool of her coat like the coat wasn't even there. January in Blackstone Ridge was the kind of cold that made you wonder if the sun had simply given up and moved on to somewhere warmer and more deserving. Behind her, arranged on a low bench like a row of mismatched buttons, sat her 7 children. Caleb was 14 and doing a poor job of pretending he wasn't scared. He kept his jaw set and his eyes forward, the way his father used to do when things were bad, but his hands were clasped so tight in his lap that his knuckles had gone the color of old bone. Ruth was 12 and had her arm around little May, who was 4 and didn't entirely understand what was happening, except that the grown-ups looked frightened, which was enough to make her cry quietly into Ruth's shoulder. Thomas was 9, sitting so still it was unnatural, his eyes moving from face to face in the crowd like he was taking inventory of enemies. The twins, Samuel and Daniel, were 7, pressed against each other on the bench with their shoulders touching. They'd been born touching and never quite managed to stop. And then there was Henry, who was 6, and who had fallen asleep somehow, despite everything, slumped sideways against Samuel with his mouth open and a thread of drool on his chin. 7 children. All of them hers, all of them watching her now from that bench. The auctioneer was a man named Prescott who ran the land office and moonlighted in situations like this one, situations where the county had run out of patience and needed someone official-looking to stand in front of a crowd and make the machinery of desperation look respectable. He was a small man with a large voice and the self-important manner of someone who had never once in his life been the one standing on the platform. "We have before us," Prescott announced, consulting his papers with the gravity of a man reading scripture, "Mrs. Abigail Mercer, widow of the late Franklin Mercer, resident of Blackstone Ridge for 3 years prior, currently holding no property, no income, and no means of support for herself or her dependents." He said dependents the way you might say infestation. Abigail kept her face still. She'd had practice. It had been 11 months since Franklin died. A fever that moved fast and left nothing. Not savings, not land, not even the mule, because the mule had been borrowed and its owner had come for it 2 days after the funeral, before Franklin was even cold in the ground. The months since had been a grinding series of small humiliations, each one teaching her how quickly neighbors could become strangers when there was nothing left to be neighborly about. She'd taken in mending. She'd washed laundry for the hotel on Tanner Street until the hotel changed ownership, and the new owner brought his wife who did the laundry herself. She'd done what she could, and what she could do had never been quite enough, and now she was standing on 3 planks of lumber in January, while a small man with a large voice cataloged her failures to a crowd of townsfolk who'd come out in the cold mostly because there wasn't much else to do on a Thursday. "The county requires that a suitable husband be identified," Prescott continued, failing which, "the children will be transferred to the county home at Fort Ellis for proper placement." Proper placement. As though her children were parcels to be sorted. May heard the word children and lifted her head from Ruth's shoulder. "Mama?" she said, her voice small and uncertain. "It's all right," Abigail said without turning around, because she didn't trust her face right then. "Sit still." The first man stepped up. Harold Finch, a widower who ran a small dry goods operation on the south end of town. He was 53 and walked with a cane, and he looked at the bench of children the way a man looks at a hole in his roof. Possible to deal with, but not without significant cost and inconvenience. He had a brief, murmured conversation with Prescott. He looked at the children again. He looked at Abigail. He stepped back into the crowd. The second man was younger, maybe 35, with a decent coat and the particular expression of someone who'd been talked into this by a well-meaning friend and was already regretting it. He got further than Finch, actually climbing the 2 steps to the platform and standing close enough to Abigail that she could smell the tobacco on his coat. He studied her for a long moment, like she was livestock at a fair. "7, he said. "Yes," she said. "All of them healthy?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. Then he looked at the bench again, and whatever arithmetic he was doing in his head came out wrong, and he descended the steps without another word. The crowd shifted. Someone coughed. A woman near the back said something quiet to the man beside her, and the man nodded, and neither of them looked at Abigail when they did it. 3 more men came and went. One didn't even make it to the platform steps. He just looked from a distance and shook his head and walked away. And somehow that was worse than the ones who'd come close enough to look her in the eye. Prescott checked his watch. He did it loudly, with the deliberate theatricality of a man who wanted the crowd to know he was being very patient and very official about all of this. "We have time for one more inquiry," he said, after which the county will proceed with, "What's the arrangement?" The voice came from the back of the crowd. It was a strange voice, not loud exactly, but with a quality that cut through the wind and the murmuring the way a cold knife cuts through fat. People turned. The crowd shifted, parting not out of politeness but out of something closer to instinct, the way animals clear space for something they're not sure about. Gideon Hale walked through the gap they made. Abigail had heard the name. Everyone in Blackstone Ridge had heard the name, the same way everyone had heard stories about the wolves that came down from the high country in hard winters. As a warning, as a thing to be aware of, as a reason to keep the door latched. He was a mountain rancher who came to town twice a year for supplies and otherwise kept to the high country north of the ridge. And the stories that attached themselves to his name had the quality of stories that grow in the absence of facts. He'd killed a man in Cheyenne. He'd been driven out of the cavalry under circumstances nobody could quite specify. He lived alone up there because no decent person could tolerate his company. Looking at him now, Abigail could see why the stories stuck. He was a large man, not tall so much as built, wide through the shoulders and chest, with the kind of physicality that comes from years of work that doesn't stop because you're tired. His coat was worn but heavy, good wool, functional rather than fashionable. His face was weathered to the color and texture of old saddle leather, with a scar that ran from his left jaw to somewhere under his collar, and dark eyes that were doing something Abigail hadn't seen in the eyes of the other men on this platform. They were actually looking at her. Not assessing, not calculating, just looking, with the careful attention of a man who knows how to read a situation. "What's the arrangement?" he said again, to Prescott this time. Not a question, a demand for information. Prescott straightened his papers. The county requires a husband willing to assume legal responsibility for Mrs. Mercer and her 7 dependents, a fee of $15 to cover administrative costs. "I'll pay $50. The crowd went very quiet. "The fee," Prescott said carefully, "is $15. I heard you. I'll pay $50. Gideon reached into his coat and produced a folded bill that he held out to Prescott without ceremony. "For the administrative costs, and whatever else needs covering." Prescott took the money with the expression of a man who has encountered a situation his paperwork did not anticipate. Gideon turned to Abigail. Up close, he was more weathered than she'd thought, and older, maybe 40, maybe more. It was hard to tell with men who'd spent that kind of time outdoors. The scar on his jaw was old and well-healed. His eyes were brown, she saw now, not black as the stories made them. "I have a ranch," he said, "north of the ridge, about 2 days' ride in fair weather. It's not comfortable, but it's warm and it's solid, and there's enough to eat." He paused. "I'm not looking for something I can't provide in return. Fair work, fair treatment. Your children will have a roof and food, and nobody telling them they're a burden." It was, Abigail thought, possibly the least romantic proposal in the history of the territory, and also the most honest she'd heard all morning. She looked at the bench. Caleb was watching Gideon with the expression of someone trying to decide if a dog was going to bite. Ruth had her chin up, which meant she was scared and trying not to show it. Little May had stopped crying and was watching with the wide-eyed openness of a child who doesn't know enough to be afraid of strangers yet. "You understand there are 7 of them," Abigail said. "I counted. They're not easy. I'd be concerned if they were." She looked at him for a long moment. She'd learned in 11 months of widowhood to read men quickly, to look for the particular quality of dishonesty that presented itself as reason or helpfulness. She didn't see it in Gideon Hale. What she saw was something harder to categorize, a man who was uncomfortable with this whole arrangement but had made a decision and was going to stick to it, because that was how he operated. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated as though confirming the terms of a business agreement, which it essentially was. Prescott shuffled his papers and began reciting the legal formulation that would make this official, and the crowd watched with the mixed expressions of people witnessing something that wasn't quite what they'd expected and weren't sure how to feel about it. Abigail turned to her children. "Come on," she said. "Get your things." "What?" The wagon Gideon had come to town with was a working vehicle, not a social one. A wide-bed freight wagon with iron-reinforced wheels and a team of 2 heavy draft horses that stood patiently in the cold with the philosophical patience of animals that have given up trying to understand human business. The bed was partially loaded with supplies: sacks of flour and cornmeal, a barrel of salt pork, coils of rope, tools wrapped in canvas. He'd made room for people, which told Abigail he hadn't come here entirely on impulse. She filed this away without commenting on it. The children loaded themselves with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The twins climbed up with the energetic lack of caution of 7-year-olds who had not yet learned to be afraid of heights. Thomas hauled himself up with deliberate competence and immediately began examining the tools with proprietary interest. Ruth climbed carefully, settling May beside her and wrapping a blanket around them both. Caleb was last, stopping at the side of the wagon and looking back at the town, at Blackstone Ridge, the only place any of them had called home since coming west, with an expression too complicated for 14. "You don't have to look," Gideon said, not unkindly. Caleb turned. "I'm not afraid to look." "I know. I didn't say you were." Gideon checked the team's harness with quick, practiced hands. "Sometimes you just don't have to." Caleb climbed into the wagon without responding, but Abigail noticed he didn't look back again. She took the front bench beside Gideon. It felt strange sitting beside a stranger who was technically now her husband, with the paperwork folded in her coat pocket and the ink barely dry, listening to the runners of the wagon begin to creak as they pulled out of town. The crowd had dispersed. Nobody came to wave them off. The hotel's curtains moved on the second floor as someone watched them go. "Thank you," Abigail said. She said it simply, without elaboration, because she didn't know how else to say it, and because he didn't seem like a man who needed speeches. Gideon was quiet for a moment, watching the horses. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You don't know what you're riding into." "I know what I was riding away from." He considered that. Then he nodded, as though she'd made a point that was difficult to argue with. "Fair enough," he said. The first day of travel was hard but manageable. The road north of Blackstone Ridge was worn enough that the wagon moved without difficulty, and the cold held steady rather than worsening, which Gideon told her was good. The children, after their initial wariness, could not sustain full silence in the presence of new things, and by mid-morning there were questions. Thomas about the tools, the twins about the horses, May about whether there would be chickens at the ranch. Gideon answered the practical questions in the same flat, informational way he seemed to approach most things. There were tools for specific purposes. The horses were named Drum and Calla. The question about chickens produced the first thing that might have been a fragment of a smile. "There are chickens," he said. "Whether they're still alive after 3 weeks with nobody home is a different question." May thought about this. "I hope they're alive." "So do I," Gideon said. And he meant it, or at least he said it like he meant it, which was close enough. They camped that night in the shelter of a rock formation that Gideon knew from previous trips, a natural windbreak where the horses could be picketed on the lee side and a fire built without the wind beating it flat. Abigail managed the cooking. She'd brought provisions from town, what little she had, and Gideon had supplies in the wagon, while Gideon tended the animals and set up a rough camp with the efficiency of someone who'd done it hundreds of times and long since stopped thinking about the steps. The children ate hungrily and quietly. Henry fell asleep almost before he finished eating, and Gideon caught him before he toppled sideways into the fire with the casual reflex of a man who'd been paying more attention than he appeared to be. He set Henry down on a bedroll with no comment, as though it was an entirely natural thing to do. Ruth watched him do it. "He does that," she said. "Falls asleep anywhere." "Good skill," Gideon said. He settled on the other side of the fire. "Wish I had it." Ruth studied him with the particular intensity of a 12-year-old who is making up her mind about a person and is not going to pretend otherwise. "People in town said you were dangerous." "Ruth," Abigail said, "I'm just saying what they said." Gideon poked at the fire. He didn't seem offended. "People in town say a lot of things about a lot of people," he said. "What else did they say?" "That you lived alone because you didn't like people." "That part's partly true." "Which part?" "I don't like most people," he said. "Doesn't mean I don't know the difference between people worth the trouble and people who aren't. He looked across the fire at Ruth. "You're going to be a problem, aren't you?" Ruth blinked. "What?" "You're the kind of person who asks the questions everyone else is thinking. Usually causes trouble." He went back to the fire. "Also usually necessary. Both can be true." Ruth stared at him for a moment. Then she said, "My mother says the same thing about me." "Your mother seems like she knows what she's looking at," Gideon said. He didn't look at Abigail when he said it, but she felt it anyway. Oh, the weather changed on the second day. It came from the north and moved fast, the way mountain weather does. The sky going from pale gray to the particular dense, suffocating white that means business before they'd covered 3 miles. Gideon pulled the wagon to a stop and stood up on the bench and looked at the sky with his hands on the seat back, and his expression was the expression of a man doing rapid and unhappy arithmetic. "How bad?" Abigail asked. "Bad enough." He sat back down and clicked the horses forward. "There's a line shack about 4 miles on. Belongs to a rancher named Cutter, who I do work with sometimes. We need to get there." "And if we don't?" "Then we stay in the wagon," he said. "And that's harder." He said it flat, not to frighten her, just because it was true. The snow started before the first mile was done. Not the gentle pictorial kind, but the hard pellet snow that comes sideways and stings exposed skin. Abigail got the children as far under the wagon's canvas cover as possible, which was most of them. Caleb, after a brief argument, agreed to stay under the canvas and hold May when May started crying from the cold. Abigail herself stayed on the bench because it seemed wrong to leave Gideon alone up there, and also because she wanted to be able to see what was happening. The visibility dropped fast. The road became a suggestion. Drum and Calla put their heads down and leaned into it with the grim determination of animals that know their job and intend to do it. And Gideon held the lines with steady hands and navigated by landmarks she couldn't see and couldn't have identified even if she could. "You've done this before," she said. Not a question. Several times. He squinted into the white. "Not usually with passengers." "Does it change anything?" He thought about it. "Makes me more careful," he said. They made the shack in just over an hour, which felt considerably longer. It was a crude structure, rough-cut logs and a sod roof that sagged slightly on one side. But it was solid, and it was there, and it had a stove and a stack of cut wood beside it. Gideon had the horses sheltered in the attached lean-to, and the children moving into the shack before Abigail had finished counting heads. Inside was cramped and cold and smelled of old fire and the particular mineral smell of sod roofing. There was a plank table and 2 chairs and a rope bunk along one wall and nothing else except the stove, which was everything. Gideon had it going with an efficiency that spoke to long practice. Paper, kindling, 2 larger pieces, the damper set just so. And within 15 minutes the metal was ticking with heat, and the children had arranged themselves around it like sunflowers, orienting toward light. "Are we going to be stuck here?" Thomas asked. He asked it with a kind of controlled calm that impressed Abigail. He'd been like that since Franklin died, as though he'd decided that someone needed to be the practical one and had appointed himself. "Depends how long it blows," Gideon said. He was stripping his outer coat and hanging it on a peg by the door, moving with the economical efficiency of a man managing wet clothing systematically. "Could be tonight, could be tomorrow." "I'm hungry," said one of the twins. Samuel, identifiable by the small scar above his left eyebrow from an encounter with a fence post 2 years ago. "I know," Abigail said. "Give me 10 minutes." She cooked on the shack stove, using what they had in the provisions bag: cornmeal, salt pork, a small sack of dried beans that were too slow for tonight, but she set them soaking for tomorrow anyway, because she was already thinking about tomorrow, which was something she'd learned to do. The result was not distinguished cuisine, but it was hot and filling, and 8 people eating hot food in a warm space after 2 hours of freezing travel were not inclined to complain. Gideon ate standing at the edge of the room, out of the way of the children, watching the window. The snow outside was a solid white nothing. "You should eat at the table," Abigail said. "It's your food." "I'm fine here." "You're in the corner because you don't know where to put yourself," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not wrong," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved to the table and sat down, and she brought him another portion, and he ate it without saying anything else, which she decided to take as agreement. That night, with the children arranged on the rope bunk and the floor with the blankets and coats arranged over them, and the storm making its steady, sustained roar outside, Abigail sat at the table with the stub of a candle and tried to think through what she'd done, what she'd agreed to. The man on the other side of the room was a stranger, legally her husband, someone whose entire history she'd heard in rumors, and whose actual character she'd had approximately 36 hours to assess. What she knew, he'd paid $50 when 15 was required. He'd caught Henry before the fire without being asked. He'd driven a team through a blinding storm with steady hands and gotten them all here intact. He'd answered Ruth's rude questions without anger. He'd moved to the table when she told him he was being strange about it. It wasn't everything, but it was something. In the bunk across the room, she could hear Henry's steady breathing and the muffled sound of two small boys breathing in near unison, the twins' synchronized sleep. Ruth had May tucked close. Caleb was awake. She could tell by the way he was holding still, the too deliberate quality of it, but he was staying quiet. Gideon was sitting against the far wall with his arms resting on his knees, watching the stove. Not asleep. Not trying to look asleep. "The rancher whose shack this is," Abigail said quietly. "Cutter. He won't mind us being here?" "He'd expect it," Gideon said. "That's what line shacks are for. Anyone traveling in this country uses what's needed when it's needed and leaves it how they found it. It's not generosity, it's just sense." "Is that your philosophy? About most things?" He thought about it. "Pretty much," he said. She looked at the candle for a moment. "Why did you do it? Come forward this morning." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I came to town for supplies," he said finally. "Saw the crowd, asked what it was. Someone told me." He shifted slightly against the wall. "I've been on that side of the crowd. Not on a platform, but I've been the person people look at and decide isn't worth the trouble." He was quiet for a moment. Seemed wrong to just stand there. It was not a romantic answer. It was not a heroic one. It was honest, and Abigail found it settled in her chest differently than a romantic answer would have. "You didn't have to pay 50, she said. "No." "Why did you?" "Because 15 felt insulting," he said, "to both of you." She thought about that for a while. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, the same way he'd nodded on the wagon bench that morning, not dismissing it, just accepting it, marking it, and moving on. Outside, the storm continued its long and different assault on the mountains, and inside the shack, 8 people who had been strangers 48 hours ago breathed the same air and waited for morning. Abigail blew out the candle. In the dark, she heard May's voice, very quiet, coming from the bunk. "Mama?" "Right here," Abigail said. "Are we going to be okay?" Abigail looked at this dark shape against the far wall. The man who had stood up in a crowd when everyone else had calculated the cost and stepped back. "Yes," she said. "I think we are." She meant it, and meaning it surprised her, and she lay down in the dark and listened to the storm wear itself out against the mountains and waited for it to break. The storm broke sometime before dawn, the way mountain storms often do. Not gradually, but all at once, like a decision being made. Abigail woke to silence and didn't trust it for a full minute, lying still in the dark, listening for the wind that had been a constant presence for hours. When it didn't come, she sat up. Gideon was already awake. He was standing at the shack's single window, looking out at whatever the storm had left behind, his arms crossed and his breath making small clouds in the air that hadn't yet warmed from the stove going cold. He'd kept the fire through the night. She knew this without being told, because the children were still warm under their pile of coats and blankets, and the wood stack beside the stove was noticeably shorter than it had been. "It's done," he said, without turning around. "How bad is the road?" "Won't know until we look." He turned from the window. "Give it an hour. Let the light come up proper so I can see what we're dealing with." She got the stove going again and made coffee from the supplies. Real coffee, which was an extravagance she noticed without commenting on. And while the children slowly surfaced from sleep in the fumbling, confused way of children who'd slept in a strange place, Gideon went out to check the horses and assess the situation with the practical single-mindedness that she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through the world. Thomas was the first child fully awake and useful, which was no surprise. He came to stand beside Abigail at the stove and said, "How far are we?" "Still a day's ride. Maybe more with the snow." "Is the road passable?" "He's checking." Thomas nodded, filed this information, and went to help Ruth with May, who was wide awake and wanting to know where they were and whether there was food and whether the chickens at the ranch had survived the storm. These three questions of approximately equal urgency in May's estimation. Gideon came back in stamping snow from his boots, carrying the particular contained expression of someone who has looked at a problem and made a decision about it. "Road's buried, but not impossible," he said. "Drum and Calla have done worse. We'll move slow and I'll walk sections of it ahead of the wagon where I'm not sure of the footing." He poured himself coffee, standing at the table. "It'll be a longer day." "All right," Abigail said. He looked at her, and she had the sense he'd expected an argument or at least a question, and her simple agreement had briefly caught him off guard. "You're not going to ask how much longer? Would the answer change anything?" He drank his coffee. "No," he said. "Then I don't need to ask." Samuel appeared at her elbow wanting cornmeal and was served, followed immediately by Daniel wanting the same thing, followed by Henry who wanted to know what the white stuff outside was, a question that revealed he had slept through the entire blizzard so completely that he had no memory of arriving at the shack and believed they were somewhere entirely new. May wanted to know again about the chickens. Gideon answered her, directly, without the slight condescension some adults used with small children, telling her the chickens were probably fine because the coop was solid built on the south side of the barn and the storm had come from the north, and May absorbed this information with the grave seriousness of someone receiving a detailed weather report. "You built the coop on the south side on purpose?" May asked. "On purpose," Gideon confirmed. "Because of storms?" "Because of storms." May nodded. "That was smart." "Thank you," Gideon said, and whatever fragment of expression crossed his face then, not quite a smile, something more reluctant than that, was enough that Abigail had to look at the stove to keep her own face neutral. They broke camp methodically, everyone doing something because there were enough somethings to go around. Abigail packed provisions. Ruth managed the younger children into their outer layers. Thomas helped Gideon load the wagon, handing things up with quiet efficiency, not talking much but positioning himself to be useful, which Gideon acknowledged with the same wordless nod he gave to competent work from any quarter. Caleb, who had woken in the dark mood that sometimes gripped him and that Abigail had learned not to push against directly, found his own task at the edges of the operation and did it without being asked. The road north was as difficult as Gideon had promised, and no worse, which itself felt like a small victory. The horses moved through the drifts with their heads low and their breath coming in heavy white plumes, and twice Gideon climbed down and walked ahead through knee-deep snow to check the ground beneath before bringing the wagon through, feeling for the road's edge with a long pole he'd taken from the shack's lean-to. Each time Abigail watched from the bench and said nothing and trusted the process, which was all she could do. Around mid-morning, with the sky a hard, bright blue above the white country, Caleb climbed from the wagon bed to the bench and sat on Abigail's other side, close enough that she could feel the cold coming off his coat. He didn't say anything for a while, just sat. "He's good with the horses," Caleb said finally, watching Gideon negotiate a drift-covered curve in the road about 30 yards ahead. "He is," Abigail agreed. "He didn't sleep last night." "I know." Caleb was quiet again, working something over. "Why would he do that? Keep the fire. He barely knows us." Abigail thought about how to answer that. She thought about what Gideon had said in the dark. "I've been on that side of the crowd. Seemed wrong to just stand there." "Some people," she said carefully, "decide what kind of person they're going to be, and then they're just that, all the way through. They don't turn it on and off depending on who's watching or what it costs." Caleb looked at her. "You think that's what he is?" "I think it might be." She paused. "I don't know him well enough to be certain, but that's what it looks like." Caleb turned this over. His jaw was doing the thing his father's jaw used to do when he was thinking hard. The resemblance was sharp enough sometimes to be almost painful. "Dad was like that," he said. "Yes," she said. "He was." They rode in silence for a bit. Ahead, Gideon had cleared the drift and was waving them forward, and Abigail clicked the team ahead and guided them through the gap he'd broken and didn't say anything more, and Caleb didn't either, but when he didn't climb back into the wagon bed, she was quietly glad. The second difficulty came in the early afternoon. They'd been making reasonable progress, the road climbing steadily into the higher country, the pines growing thicker and heavier with snow on either side, When the wagon's left rear wheel found the edge of the road beneath a drift and broke through the frozen crust of snow into a rut underneath. The wagon lurched hard, tilting, and there was a crash of shifting freight and two children's voices crying out, and then a lot of noise that resolved into the wagon sitting at an angle with its left rear corner down and the horses confused and stamping. Nobody was hurt. This was the first thing established, Abigail doing a rapid count and check that ended with May clinging to her neck and crying more from fright than injury, and all other 7 people accounted for and intact. Then the assessment of the wagon, which was the second problem. The wheel had not broken, but the wagon bed's left rear corner had dropped into the rut, and the angle was steep enough that driving out of it wasn't possible without the wheel spinning free. Gideon crouched in the snow and looked at it for a while. "We need to lift it," he said. "Get something under the wheel." "What do you need?" Thomas asked. He was already beside Gideon, in the snow, assessing with the same focused practicality. "Timber. Something solid. There will be deadfall in the trees." Thomas was already moving toward the tree line. Caleb followed without being asked. Gideon looked at Abigail. "Can you hold the team steady? They're going to feel the weight shift." "Yes," she said. She handed May to Ruth and went to the horses, taking Drum's head with both hands and talking to him in the low, steady voice she'd used with animals since she was a girl, the words not mattering as much as the tone. "You're all right. I've got you. Just hold still. You're fine." And Drum's great head dropped slightly and he steadied, and Kala, following Drum's cue, did the same. The boys came back with 2 lengths of deadfall, solid enough. Gideon and Thomas worked the timber under the wheel with the coordination of people who've figured out they think about physical problems the same way, talking in short, practical sentences about angle and leverage and what needed to happen in what order. Caleb positioned himself at the wagon's corner. "When I say," Gideon said, "you push. All 3 of us, same moment." "I can help," Samuel said from the wagon bed. "Stay in the wagon," Gideon said. "I need the weight where it is." He looked up. "Ready?" "Ready," Thomas and Caleb said together. "Now." It was ugly, and it took 2 tries, and the second try involved a great deal of grunting and Gideon's boot sliding in the snow, so he went down on one knee in an undignified way that he ignored entirely, and then the wheel was up and on the timber and the wagon rolled back onto the road, and the horses stepped forward, and they were through. Gideon stood in the snow and looked at his hands, which were red from the cold and the effort. "Good," he said. Just that. Thomas looked at him with an expression that was the closest thing to admiration he'd shown since they left Blackstone Ridge, though he would not have called it that and would have disputed the description if challenged. He just looked at Gideon for a moment and then looked away and said, "What do we do about the road edge under the drift?" "So it doesn't happen again?" "Walk it out ahead of the wagon," Gideon said, "like I was doing before. I got careless." "I can do that," Thomas said. "Walk ahead. You drive." Gideon looked at him steadily. Thomas was 9 years old and small for it, and the snow on either side of the track was past his waist. But his face was a 9-year-old's face with a 40-year-old's expression in it, and Gideon seemed to weigh this without condescension. "Stay to the center of the track," Gideon said. "If it feels wrong underfoot, stop and tell me. Don't guess." "I won't guess," Thomas said. They traveled the rest of the afternoon that way, Thomas breaking trail ahead of the wagon like a small, serious scout, occasionally holding up a hand to signal caution, and the wagon moving behind him with Gideon driving and Abigail watching from the bench and thinking about what it meant that her 9-year-old son was walking point on a mountain road in 2 feet of snow and had asked to do it, and the strange mixture of pride and grief that came with that, because he shouldn't have had to grow up so fast, but he had, and he was doing it anyway. They made camp again that evening in a natural hollow that Gideon had camped in before, with a good fire and the horses on the lee side and the night cold. But still. The children ate, and some of them were asleep before the bowls were cleaned. Henry fell asleep on Thomas, who bore this with resigned patience. "He always does that," Thomas said. "I noticed," Gideon said. You could move him." "I'll move him when he's properly under." Thomas looked at him. Then he looked at Henry's sleeping face. Something in his own face shifted briefly before the careful composure came back. "He used to do that to my father," he said. "Fall asleep on him." Gideon said nothing for a moment. "What was he like?" he said. "Your father." It was a question that could have been tactless, the kind of thing you don't ask, and Thomas seemed to consider whether to answer it. Then he said, "He was funny, not joke funny, just things he said. He'd say the most serious thing in the serious voice, and then you'd figure out a minute later it was funny." He paused. He worked hard. He didn't complain about things. When something was hard, he just did it. Gideon nodded. "He sounds like he was a good man," he said. "He was," Thomas said, and then, after a pause, "He would have liked you, I think, the way you handle things." It was perhaps the most complicated compliment Gideon Hale had ever received. Abigail, who had heard this from the other side of the fire, kept very still and watched the flames. "That means something," Gideon said, quietly, meaning it. Thomas moved Henry carefully to a blanket and lay down himself, and was asleep within minutes. Gideon sat with the fire for a while, and Abigail sat with it too, and neither of them said anything, and the silence was not uncomfortable. "He's a good boy," Gideon said finally. "He's had a hard year," she said. "I know." He poked at the fire. "They all have, but they're not broken by it. Whatever you've been doing to keep that from happening, it's working." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "I don't always know what I'm doing," she said. "Most of it is guessing and hoping. That's most of parenting, from what I understand." "You don't have children." "No." He said it without apparent regret and without the specific edge of grief that she would have recognized as something more complicated. Just a fact. "No, I don't." "Have you ever wanted them?" He thought about it with the same careful deliberation he brought to everything. "I never got far enough in any situation to have to decide," he said. "Life went other directions." She wanted to ask about those other directions. She didn't, because it was too soon and the fire was burning low and she was tired in every part of herself, and some questions kept. "I want to tell you something," she said instead. He looked at her. "I wasn't going to fall apart," she said, "on that platform. Whatever happened. I want you to know that. I was scared and I didn't know what was going to happen, but I wasn't going to let those children watch me fall apart." "I know," he said. "I could see that. I just want to be clear that I don't need saving. I needed help. There's a difference." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "There's a big difference," he agreed. "And I wasn't trying to save you. I was trying to make a situation that was wrong into one that was less wrong." He paused. Whether it worked is still being determined. The faintest edge of dry humor in it, almost concealed. "I suppose it is," she said, and there was something in her own voice she hadn't expected. A small warmth. She looked at the fire and he looked at the fire, and the night stayed still around them. They arrived the following afternoon. The valley came into view from the top of a long ridge, appearing below them like something that had been hidden on purpose. A broad, sheltered bowl between the mountains, south-facing, with a creek running through the lower third of it, and the ranch building set back from the creek on a slight rise. The main house was substantial, not elegant but solidly built, 2 stories with a wide covered porch on the south side, a large barn, several outbuildings, fencing that covered more ground than Abigail had expected. The children saw it at the same moment, and the wagon went from near silence to multiple voices at once. "Is that it?" Ruth asked, standing up in the wagon bed. "Sit down," Abigail said automatically. "But is that—" "Yes," Gideon said. "That's it." May pressed herself against the front of the wagon bed and stared with absolute focus. "I see the barn," she announced. "The chickens are probably in the barn." "Probably," Gideon agreed. "Can I check when we get there?" First thing. The descent into the valley was slow but straightforward. The road here was his road, built by his hands and maintained by his use, and it held firm under the wagon. Abigail watched the valley open up around them as they came down, taking measure of it the way she'd been taking measure of everything since she'd put her future in the hands of a stranger in a snowstorm. What she saw was work, sustained, serious, accumulative work, the kind that doesn't result from a good season or a lucky streak, but from years of consistent effort, decisions made and kept, repairs made before things failed. The fencing was tight. The barn roof was sound. The house had new boards on the north-facing wall where old ones had been replaced, and the window frames were freshly caulked against the winter. Whoever Gideon Hale was, he had built this by himself, and he had built it well. She hadn't expected that. The stories from town had given her a rough man living rough. What the valley showed her was a man who knew how to make things last. When the wagon pulled into the yard and stopped, she sat for a moment before climbing down, just taking it in. The quiet of the valley, the mountains on three sides, the particular quality of stillness that comes when wind can't find you. After 2 days of cold and effort and the sustained tension of managing 7 children through uncertain country, the stillness was almost physical. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. May was already over the side of the wagon before anyone could stop her, hitting the snow with a determined thud and making immediately for the barn at the urgent trot of a 4-year-old on a mission. Ruth scrambled after her. Gideon watched them go with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "She's determined," Abigail said. I noticed. The chickens were alive. May returned 20 minutes later with this news at considerable volume, followed by Ruth, who confirmed it in a more measured tone while quietly looking at the house with the expression of someone doing rapid calculations about sleeping arrangements. Thomas and Caleb had begun a systematic inspection of the outbuildings, again without being asked, and were reporting their findings to each other in low voices. The twins had discovered there was a slight slope in the yard that, with sufficient running speed, could be used for sliding, and were pursuing this research with full commitment. Henry stood next to Abigail and held her hand and looked at all of it. "Is this our house?" he asked. Abigail looked at Gideon. Gideon crouched down so he was at Henry's level, which required significant physical effort from a man his size, and which he accomplished without apparently considering whether to do it. He looked at Henry directly. "This is our house," he said. "All of us." Henry looked at the house. Then he looked at Gideon. Then, with the decisive completeness of a 6-year-old social processing, he nodded and said, "Okay," and walked toward the porch steps. Gideon stood back up. He was looking at the house too. "The east room upstairs is the largest," he said. "The girls can have it. The boys can take the 2 smaller rooms and work something out. I've been sleeping in the downstairs back room. I can stay there." He paused. "The kitchen wants work. The stovepipe needs cleaning. I know the list." "We'll figure out the list," Abigail said. He nodded. He was still looking at the house, and she had the strange, clear sense that he was seeing it differently now. That a building he'd been alone in for years was suddenly, from this moment, something else. And he was in the process of adjusting to that, and it was not a small adjustment. "It'll be different," he said, meaning the house, meaning everything. "Yes," she said, "it will." She walked toward the porch, following Henry, and when she put her hand on the door he'd built, to the house he'd built, in the valley he'd shaped by years of solitary work, she felt something she couldn't quite name settle into her chest. Not comfort, exactly. Not yet. But the possibility of it, which, after everything, was enough to start. Behind her, she could hear May's voice from somewhere near the barn, explaining to Ruth at considerable length about the relative health and personality of each individual chicken, her assessment detailed and authoritative and entirely her own. And beneath it, barely audible, what might have been Gideon Hale's voice saying something in response to something Caleb had asked. The two of them standing in the yard with the afternoon light slanting cold and gold across the snow. Abigail pushed the door open and went inside. The first 2 weeks in the valley were harder than Abigail had anticipated and easier than she'd feared, which she decided was probably the best she could have hoped for. The house was solid, but it had been a bachelor's house, organized around the needs of one person with no concessions to anything else, which meant the kitchen had 1 pot and 2 plates and a Dutch oven that was excellent for its purpose, but could not feed 9 people without creative thinking. The sleeping arrangements required negotiation among the boys, which Caleb managed with the brittle authority of an oldest child who didn't entirely trust his own position yet. The twins objected to sharing a room with Thomas on the grounds that Thomas was too serious and organized their shared spaces in ways they found oppressive. Thomas objected to sharing a room with the twins on the grounds that they were chaos in human form. This debate ran for 3 days and was eventually settled by Abigail in a manner that satisfied nobody completely, which she'd learned was usually the sign of a fair resolution. Gideon moved through all of this with the expression of a man watching weather he'd never encountered before and wasn't sure how to dress for. He was not a man accustomed to noise. The ranch had been his alone for years, and he'd built his routines around silence. Early mornings in the barn before light, work that followed a logic of season and necessity, evenings that ended when he decided they ended. None of this survived contact with 7 children. The twins were constitutionally incapable of moving through a space without producing sound. Henry had a laugh that could be heard from the far side of the barn. May maintained a running commentary on everything she observed, every chicken, every cloud, every mouse track in the snow around the feed shed, offered to any available adult in the vicinity, regardless of what that adult was currently doing. Abigail watched Gideon navigate this with the attention she'd been paying to everything since the platform in Blackstone Ridge, looking for the thing beneath the surface of his reactions, the real man working underneath the weathered exterior. What she saw was someone who was frequently surprised but rarely annoyed. He'd stop what he was doing when May appeared at his elbow with a new observation and listen to it with the same full attention he gave to things that actually mattered, which seemed to confuse May briefly each time before she launched into whatever it was. He didn't ruffle her hair or talk down to her or do any of the things adults do when they're managing a small child rather than listening to one. He just listened. It cost him something. Abigail could see that. The interruptions and the noise and the constant recalibration of a house that had stopped being just his. It took a real effort, and there were mornings when he was quieter than usual, and she recognized it as the quiet of a man who needed more stillness than he was currently getting and was not going to say so. She started getting up earlier. There was a window in the kitchen that faced east and caught the first light before the mountains blocked it, and she started her mornings there. Fire going, coffee on, the house still quiet around her. Gideon came in from the barn at the same time each morning, and for a week he seemed mildly surprised to find the coffee already made and someone sitting in his kitchen before he arrived. Then he stopped being surprised, and they settled into a 20-minute routine of morning quiet together before the house woke up. Coffee and the sound of the stove and whatever needed to be said about the day's work, and what didn't need to be said left alone. It was the most intimate thing about their arrangement those mornings. More so than the technicality of their marriage, more than sharing a roof. The willingness to be in the same silence. "The south fence needs work," he said one morning, without preamble, in the middle of his second cup. "Post is heaving from the frost. If I don't get to it before a hard thaw, it'll be down." "Thomas could help," Abigail said. "He'd want to. He's 9. He knows what he's doing with tools. You've seen him." Gideon considered this over his coffee. "I've seen him," he agreed. "I'll ask him. He'll say yes." "I know he'll say yes. That's not the question." He looked at her. "The question is whether it's right to have him working fence in January when he should be—" He paused. "What should a 9-year-old be doing in January?" "In normal circumstances, school," Abigail said, "which we don't have here." "No." He set his cup down. "I've been thinking about that. There's a woman in Millhaven, 30 miles south, who taught school before she married. Martha Keel. Her husband does cattle work. She might be willing to come up 1 or 2 days a week, do some teaching. I could pay her for the time." Abigail looked at him. "You've been thinking about school," she said. "They should have it." He said it as a statement of straightforward logistics, not sentiment. "They're smart, your children, particularly Ruth. She's reading at a level that should be pushed further. You noticed that. She corrected my arithmetic when we were figuring feed ratios last week." A pause. She was right. Abigail sat with that for a moment. This man who'd spent years alone on a mountain had noticed which of her children was reading above their level and was working out how to address it. She didn't say what she was thinking. She just said, "Let's ask Martha Keel." It was 3 weeks before Rufus Kane came. The first sign wasn't the man himself, but the effect he had on other things. Gideon came in from checking the north pasture one afternoon in the 3rd week of February with a particular quality of stillness about him that Abigail had learned to read as controlled concern. Not quite worry, but the state adjacent to it, the state of a man who has seen something he doesn't like and is deciding how to respond. "What?" she said. He hung his coat. Cattle disturbed in the north pasture. Something moved through the tree line on the east side to track patterns wrong for animals. "People?" "One person, big, wearing boots with worn heels, so the right one more than the left." He poured water from the pitcher and drank it. "I know one person who walks that pattern." She waited. "Rufus Kane," he said. She didn't know the name. He explained briefly and without embellishment the way he explained things he didn't enjoy explaining. Rufus Kane operated in the territory north of Blackstone Ridge as a kind of human bad weather. He wasn't an outlaw in the organized sense, no gang, no clear criminal enterprise, but he took things he decided he wanted, and he dealt with opposition badly, and the territory had learned to accommodate this the way it accommodated other dangerous and unpredictable natural phenomena. He and Gideon had a history that Gideon described in 4 sentences, the condensed version of which was that Rufus Kane had decided several years ago that Gideon's eastern pasture ought to be his, and Gideon had disagreed in terms direct enough that Rufus had not come back. Until now, Abigail said. Until now. He looked at the window. He'll have heard in town. About the arrangement. About you and the children. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. He sees a change, she said. He thinks it makes you easier to deal with. Gideon looked at her. That's exactly right, he said, with a flatness that told her he'd reached the same conclusion and didn't enjoy having it confirmed. What do we do? We continue normally, he said. I'm not going to rearrange our lives around Rufus Kane's intentions, but I want you to know, and I want Caleb to know, not to frighten him, but because he's the oldest and he should understand the situation. Abigail nodded. And I want you to know where the rifle is, he said, and how to use it, if you don't already. I already know, she said. He looked at her with something that might have been assessment and might have been relief. Franklin hunted, she said. I learned. I'm not fast, but I'm accurate. Accurate's more useful, he said. She told Caleb that evening after the younger children were in bed, sitting with him at the kitchen table while Gideon worked at something in the barn. She told it straight, the way Gideon had told her. The facts, the context, what it meant and what it didn't. Caleb listened with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set. Is he dangerous? Caleb asked. Gideon thinks he could be, yes. What should I do? What you're already doing, she said. You keep track of where everyone is. You're the oldest. If something feels wrong, you come find me or Gideon immediately. You don't try to handle it yourself. And if I can't find either of you? You get your brothers and sisters into the house, and you bar the door, and you wait. She looked at him. You understand me? You don't go outside. You don't try to be brave. Brave right now means keeping the little ones safe. Caleb nodded. His face had gone older than 14 in the candlelight. I hate this, he said. I know. We just got here, he said, and the frustration in it was raw. He stopped, started again. It's not fair. No, she agreed. It isn't. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at her with an expression she recognized as the one Franklin used to get when he'd finished feeling something and was ready to do something about it. Okay, he said. Okay, I understand. Rufus Kane came on a Thursday. The day had been unremarkable up to that point, cold but clear, the kind of February morning where the light was hard and clean and the snow held the shapes of everything like a careful record of the world. Gideon and Thomas were at the south fence doing the work Gideon had promised, a long project involving new posts and frozen ground that Thomas had thrown himself into with characteristic focus. The twins were supposedly doing the morning feeding with Caleb's oversight, but had discovered that the water trough made an excellent slide when iced over and were pursuing this discovery with dedication. Ruth was inside with May and Henry, working through the reading exercises that Martha Keel had left with them after her first visit the week before. Abigail was in the kitchen doing the week's inventory. She heard the horse before she saw it, a single rider coming down the valley road at a pace that wasn't quite urgent, but wasn't casual either. She moved to the kitchen window and looked out. The man on the horse was large, in a way that went beyond physical size, large with a quality of presence that had learned to use its own mass as a kind of announcement. He was riding a dark horse and wearing a heavy coat and a hat pulled low, and even at distance there was something in the way he sat the saddle that said he had considered whether he had a right to be wherever he was and had decided the answer was yes and moved on. Rufus Kane. She didn't know for certain. She'd never seen him, but she knew. She went to the back room and got the rifle and checked it. Loaded, which she'd made certain of 3 days ago. And then she went to the door and stood there for a moment, thinking about what Gideon was doing. The south fence was on the far side of the barn, out of sight line from the yard. He wouldn't have seen the rider come in. She could go get him. That was an option. She looked at the rider dismounting in the yard, tying his horse to the fence post with the familiar ease of someone who expected to be there a while. By the time she went around the barn and got Gideon and came back, this man would have been standing in her yard for several minutes, which was not a situation she cared for. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The man looked up at her. His face was broad and ruddy from cold and several days' growth of beard, and his eyes were light-colored, blue or gray. The distance made it hard to tell, and they did the thing eyes do when they're assessing something they think they can take. Not threatening exactly, just weighing. "Morning," he said. Pleasant enough voice. That was somehow worse. "Morning," Abigail said. She had the rifle along her right leg, not raised, not concealed either, just present. His eyes found it, registered it, returned to her face. "Gideon Hale around?" he asked. "He's on the property," she said. "Mind if I wait?" "I do, a little," she said. "What's your business?" He smiled at that, a smile with a lot of teeth and very little warmth. "Just neighbor business, ma'am. Heard he'd gotten himself a family. Wanted to pay my respects." "You're Rufus Kane," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not the smile. The smile stayed. Something behind it. "He mentioned me?" Kane said. "He did." "Good things, I hope." "Accurate things," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with those light eyes, and she stood on the porch and didn't move and didn't look away, because she had stood on a platform in a frozen town, while a crowd of people decided she wasn't worth the trouble, and she had not looked away then either. And this man with his assessing eyes was not going to be harder than that. "You're not what I expected," Kane said. "What did you expect?" "Someone more grateful for the situation." He said it with a particular emphasis, a slight lean, implying things about her circumstances that made her jaw tighten. "I'm grateful for a great many things," she said evenly. "None of them your business." He laughed at that, genuine enough, which somehow made it worse. "I like you," he said, as though she needed to know and would be pleased by it. "Mr. Kane," she said, "I'm going to ask you to take your horse and leave this property." "I haven't seen Gideon yet." "He'll find you in town if he has business with you," she said. "He won't be looking for you here." Kane looked at the house. He looked at the barn. He was taking inventory, she understood, noting the horses in the corral, the children's things visible in the yard, the general evidence of a ranch that had recently gotten more complicated and therefore, in his calculation, more vulnerable. "Nice place he's built," Kane said. "Takes a lot of work, holding something like this together." He looked at her again. "A lot of mouths to feed now, too, I hear." "We manage fine," she said. "Sure you do." He put one foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle, and from the height of the horse he looked down at her with that expression that had nothing to do with the smile underneath it. "Just seems like a man with that kind of load, family, ranch, all those children, might appreciate some help from a neighbor. Share a little of the burden." "We don't need any help," Abigail said. "Everyone needs help eventually," Kane said. He held her gaze for another moment, long enough to make the point, short enough to leave it technically cordial. And then he turned the horse and rode out of the yard at the same unhurried pace he'd arrived. Abigail stood on the porch until he was out of the valley road and out of sight. Then she lowered the rifle and let out a breath that had apparently been waiting. Gideon came around the side of the barn 2 minutes later, Thomas at his shoulder, both of them moving with the quick, purposeful stride of people who've registered that something has happened. "I saw him leaving," Gideon said. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. "Are you all right?" "Fine," she said. "He didn't do anything, just talked." "What did he say?" She told him, accurately and without editorializing, the way she'd tell him anything that needed to be reported rather than processed. Gideon listened without interruption, his face doing the thing it did when he was thinking hard and not showing it. "He's testing," he said when she finished. "I know." He wanted to see what was here and how it was organized. He looked down the valley road. "He'll come back." "I know that too." She paused. "He said everyone needs help eventually. He meant it as a threat." "He usually does." Gideon looked at her. "You held your ground." "Of course I held my ground," she said, with a heat that surprised her slightly. "This is our porch." Thomas, who had been standing quietly processing all of this, said, "Should we tell the others?" Gideon and Abigail looked at each other. "The older ones," Abigail said, "Ruth and Caleb. Age-appropriate versions for the younger children. Just that we had an unwelcome visitor, and to come inside and tell us immediately if they see a stranger on the property." "What about me?" Thomas asked. "You're one of the older ones," Abigail said. He took this with the gravity it deserved. The days that followed had a particular quality of alertness that sat underneath the normal routines of the ranch like a bass note under melody. The work continued. Fence, feeding, the slow and grinding work of a winter ranch. But there was an awareness in it, a peripheral attention to the tree line and the valley road that had not been there before. Gideon said very little about it, but he adjusted small things. The position of the barn door, which could now be seen from the kitchen window. The routine of checking the perimeter of the property in the evenings, which had always been his habit, but was now more systematic. A word with Caleb about which of the outbuildings had sight lines to the main road and which didn't. He was not afraid. That was the thing Abigail watched for and verified. Not because she needed him to be fearless, but because she needed to know what quality of trouble they were dealing with. A man who was afraid of Rufus Cain was a man who thought Cain might win. Gideon was alert, not afraid. He was calculating responses to a problem he considered manageable and managing it methodically. The children felt the change in the air even without being told the details. Children always do. The twins were slightly less chaotic, which was remarkable. Ruth spent more time in the kitchen in the evenings, which Abigail understood as Ruth positioning herself near the adults without admitting that's what she was doing. Even May seemed to sense something. Though her response was characteristically her own, she began providing Abigail with detailed reports on the chickens' emotional states each evening, as though maintaining accurate surveillance on the barn population was her personal contribution to the household's security. On a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of March, with the light shifting toward the longer days that would eventually mean spring, Gideon came in from the north pasture and sat at the kitchen table and said, "He's been in the tree line again. 2 nights running." Abigail was at the stove. She didn't turn around immediately. "Is he building to something?" she asked. "Yes," he said it flatly. "He's done the watching. Next time he comes, it won't be to talk." She turned. "What does he want?" "He wants the ranch," Gideon said. "He's always wanted the eastern pasture. Now he thinks he's got a reason to push. That I'm weakened, that having a family makes me hesitate." He looked at his hands, which were rough from cold and work, spread flat on the table. He's not entirely wrong that it changes things. But he's wrong about how. "What do you mean?" He looked up at her. "Having something worth protecting isn't a weakness," he said. "It just changes what you're willing to do." The following morning, the wagon Gideon had sent to Millhaven with a message returned with word that the territorial deputy was unavailable, out of the county on other business, expected back in 2 weeks, possibly 3. The local law in Blackstone Ridge, such as it was a town marshal who had no authority in the county north of the ridge and less interest. There was no help coming from that direction in any time frame that was relevant to the situation at hand. Gideon read the message, folded it, and set it on the table. "All right," he said. "All right what?" Abigail asked. "We handle it ourselves." He said it with the same tone he used when a fence post was heaving or a wheel was in a rut, a problem with a solution that needed to be worked through. "I'm not going to wait for him to choose his moment." "What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment. "Go talk to him. In a place and time of my choosing, not his." "That's not going to work," she said. He looked at her. "He didn't come back here to talk," she said. "You know that. He came the first time to talk. He's been watching from the tree line for 2 weeks. He's past the talking stage." The muscle in Gideon's jaw moved. "You're right," he said. "So what else?" "I get him off the property," he said. "Permanently. However that needs to happen." The conversation stopped there because Ruth came in from outside with the twins in tow wanting lunch, and the house resumed its normal operations. And the problem of Rufus Cain went back under the surface of things the way problems do when life needs to keep moving. But it didn't go away. Cain came 3 days later at midday, and he did not come to talk. Abigail was in the yard with the younger children, May chasing the chickens in the perpetual low-stakes drama of their relationship, Henry watching with judicial interest. Samuel and Daniel executing some elaborate game whose rules were opaque to everyone but them, when she heard the horse come down the valley road at a pace that was wrong. Not a visiting pace, not the pace of someone coming to negotiate. She had the rifle inside. The distance to the house door was 30 feet. She looked at the children. "Inside," she said. "Now, all of you." Her voice had a quality that got immediate compliance even from the twins. They went. She got them through the door and turned, and Rufus Kane was already in the yard on the dark horse, and behind him, which she hadn't seen before, was a second man on a gray, younger, with a hard, flat face that didn't show much. Kane looked at the empty yard, looked at the house. "Where's Hale?" he said. "Not here," Abigail said from the doorway. The rifle was inside, leaning against the wall 6 inches from her hand. "I can see that." He stepped down from the horse. Behind him, the second man did the same. "We'll wait." "You won't," she said. Kane looked at her with something that had dropped all the pleasantness of the first visit. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been real patient with you, but I'm done being patient." He walked toward the porch, and there was nothing casual in it now, nothing that pretended at courtesy. "This property is going to change hands. It'd be better for everyone, especially those children of yours, if Hale understands that and comes to some kind of arrangement." She reached inside and picked up the rifle. Kane stopped. "Last time you had that, you kept it down," he said. "I'm not keeping it down this time," she said. His eyes were flat and light and entirely without the quality of a man who was going to be talked out of what he'd come here to do. "Put it away," he said, "before you do something that makes this worse." "It's already as bad as it gets," she said. "You came onto our property, you're threatening my family, and you brought company." Her voice was steady, and she was faintly surprised by that, by the quality of calm in it that was not the absence of fear, but something beyond it, on the other side of it, where there was only what needed to happen. "I'm asking you one time, leave." He took another step toward the porch, and then Gideon's voice came from the far end of the yard, from around the corner of the barn, hard and carrying. "Kane." What happened next was fast and bad and didn't resolve the way anyone planned. Kane turned toward the voice, and his companion turned too, and something in the movement of the second man made it immediately clear that this was not going to be a conversation. Gideon came around the barn corner, and he'd read it the same way. Abigail could tell by the set of his shoulders, the particular way he was moving, not toward Kane, but toward a position, trying to control the space. Kane went at him directly. That was the thing about Kane that the stories hadn't quite captured. The size of the stories was right, but the speed was not. He moved fast for his build, with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this before and knew where to put his weight and when. They collided in the middle of the yard, and it was brutal and immediate, and nothing like the formalized violence Abigail had seen before. The second man circled, looking for a moment, and Abigail tracked him with the rifle from the porch because he was the variable she couldn't control, the one who could change everything if she let him find his angle. "Don't move," she said to the second man. He stopped, calculating, looking at her. In the yard, Kane had Gideon against the fence rail, and the rail was not going to hold, and it didn't. It splintered, and they went down together into the snow, and it was bad, the grinding, ugly reality of 2 large men doing serious damage to each other in the cold. Gideon fought smart. She could see that even from here, using angles and leverage where he could. But Kane was finding the same angles, and he was strong in a way that was starting to tell. She could not shoot into that, not without hitting Gideon. She looked at the second man. He was looking at the fight, calculating whether her attention had shifted. "I will shoot you," she said, completely calm, meaning it completely. He looked at her and believed her, and he stayed where he was. In the yard, Kane had gotten above Gideon, had his forearm across Gideon's throat, and the sound of it, the particular desperate quality of Gideon's breathing that said this was real and not sustainable, reached her on the porch and did something to her that wasn't a decision in any rational sense. She moved off the porch. She cleared the second man on her left, keeping distance, keeping the rifle where he could see the barrel, and she crossed the yard and she came up behind Kane with the rifle, and she drove the stock into his back between his shoulder blades with everything she had. Not trying for anything neat or controlled, just driving it in with the force of someone who had already decided this was happening and was past the point where consequences factored into the calculation. Kane's grip on Gideon broke. He turned toward her and he was enraged in a way that was entirely physical. A large man who'd been hurt and was reorienting to the source of it, and she stepped back and leveled the rifle at his face from a distance of 8 feet and said, "I will not miss from here." The yard went very still. Caleb's voice came from the porch. She hadn't known he was there, hadn't seen him come out. "I've got the other one." She did not look at the porch to check this because she could not look away from Cain, but she heard it and filed it. And from the way the second man's body changed, Caleb had something convincing. Cain looked at her. Really looked at her. Possibly for the first time, with the expression of a man who has arrived at a situation he didn't account for and is trying to determine what to do with that. Gideon got to his feet behind Cain. His face was a mess. Blood from his nose, already swelling at the cheekbone. He stood and breathed and did not speak yet, because right now the rifle in Abigail's hands was the controlling element and everyone in the yard knew it. "This is done," Abigail said to Cain. Her voice had not changed. "Get on your horse and leave this valley. If you come back, I won't say anything first. Do you understand me?" Cain's light eyes were on her. "You've made enemies today," he said. "You came to my house twice," she said, "with threats and a partner and bad intentions. I think we both know who made the enemies here." Something moved through his expression. Not chastened, nothing like that, but a recalculation, a reassessment of variables he hadn't weighted correctly. He turned and walked to his horse and mounted, and the second man, released from whatever Caleb had on him, did the same, and they rode out of the yard and down the valley road without looking back. Abigail stood in the snow with the rifle at her side and watched them go. When they were out of sight, her hands started shaking. Not badly, just enough that she noticed. Gideon came to stand beside her. He was breathing carefully, the way you breathe when something hurts, but you're not going to say so. "Your face," she said. "I know," he said. "Are you all right?" He was quiet for a moment, looking down the empty road. "Because of you," he said. It wasn't quite an answer to her question, and it was more than she'd expected from him, and she stood in the cold with her shaking hands and looked at the valley road and didn't say anything back, because some things land better if you just let them. Behind her on the porch, she heard Caleb exhale, the long, controlled exhale of someone who had been holding their breath without quite realizing it. Then May's voice from inside the house, wanting to know if they could come out now. The chickens were making noise. Normal life pressing back in, the way it always did. Gideon turned toward the house. "Come on," he said. "Let's get inside." They got Gideon inside and sat him at the kitchen table, and Abigail looked at his face in proper light and decided that the damage, while ugly, was survivable. His nose had stopped bleeding on its own. The cheekbone was swollen badly and would darken to something spectacular by morning, and there was a cut above his left eyebrow from the fence rail that needed cleaning and probably a stitch or two, and his ribs on the right side were either cracked or bruised. She could tell by the way he breathed, the slight shortening of each inhale that meant moving his chest. The full distance was not something he was willing to do right now. "Shirt off," she said. He looked at her. "I need to see the ribs," she said. "Don't be difficult." He wasn't difficult. He worked the shirt off with the careful movements of a man trying to minimize the number of directions he moved his torso. And Abigail looked at the right side of his rib cage and pressed along it with her fingers in a way that made him go very still and breathe very carefully. "2 at least," she said. "Maybe 3. Cracked, not broken. You'll know if they're broken because you won't be able to breathe at all." "I know what broken ribs feel like," he said. "Then you know what you're working with." She straightened. "I can wrap them. It won't fix them, but it'll make the next few weeks less miserable." "Weeks," he said. "Ribs take time. You know this." He did know this, and he didn't argue, which told her more about how much they hurt than his expression did. She wrapped his ribs with strips of cloth from the linen she kept for exactly these kinds of occasions. Frontier life was not short on occasions requiring bandaging, and he sat at the table and breathed as steadily as he could, and didn't make a sound, which she had expected but still found remarkable. The children had distributed themselves around the kitchen in the particular way of people who want to be present but don't want to be in the way. Ruth had May in her lap at the far end of the table, both of them watching. Thomas stood near the stove with his arms crossed and his face serious. The twins were side by side in the doorway to the hall, wide-eyed but quiet, which was unusual enough to mark the gravity of the situation. Henry was on the floor near Abigail's feet, which was where he went when he was frightened and needed proximity without requiring acknowledgement. Caleb was at the window, looking out at the yard. He'd been at the window since they came inside, standing with his arms at his sides and his back very straight. Abigail had noted this without addressing it yet because there was a sequence to things, and Gideon's ribs came first. When she'd finished wrapping, she said to Ruth, "Take the younger ones upstairs. Give May her chicken story. She knows the one. Don't come down until I call you." Ruth stood with May on her hip, gathering the twins with a look. Thomas didn't move. "Thomas?" Abigail said. "I'm not a younger one," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I'm asking you to go anyway." He looked at Gideon, who looked back at him steadily. And then Thomas went, following Ruth without further argument, which was a form of maturity, she noted. Henry got up from the floor and climbed into Gideon's lap before anyone could redirect him, which produced a sharp, bitten-off sound from Gideon as Henry's elbow connected with the wrapped ribs. "Henry?" Abigail started. "It's all right," Gideon said through his teeth, repositioning Henry with careful hands to minimize contact with his right side. Henry settled against him with complete confidence and looked at the room as though this was entirely normal and no further commentary was required. Gideon's jaw was tight with pain, and there was something in his face that was not pain, something that Henry's uncomplicated trust had put there, that he hadn't had time to conceal before it arrived. "I'll take him," Abigail said. "Leave him," Gideon said quietly. She left him. She went to stand beside Caleb at the window. The yard was empty in the afternoon light, just the broken fence rail in the snow and the marks left by boots and hooves, the physical record of what had happened. "You did well," she said to Caleb. "I didn't do anything," he said. "I came out and I picked up the hatchet from the woodpile and I held it. And the man decided to stay where he was. He was looking at the yard. You're the one who stopped it." "We stopped it," she said. "You walked across that yard," he said. He said it with a flatness that she recognized as the tone people use when they're describing something they're still processing. That man could have, "I know what he could have done," she said. "I thought about it while I was doing it." Caleb turned and looked at her, and his face in that moment was the face of a 14-year-old who has just watched his mother do something that rearranged his understanding of who she was. "I didn't know you could do that," he said. "Neither did I," she said. "Not exactly." She paused. "You don't know what you'll do until you have to do it. That's just true." He was quiet for a moment. "Is he going to come back?" Caleb asked. "I don't know." "Gideon thinks he will." She looked at the table where Gideon was sitting with Henry settled against his good side and his eyes on the middle distance, thinking through something. "I think we need to be prepared for that possibility," she said. "But I also think what happened today changed something. He came here expecting what he expected, and he got something different." She looked at her son. "Sometimes that's enough." "And sometimes it isn't," Caleb said. "And sometimes it isn't," she agreed. "Which is why we stay careful." Caleb looked at the yard one more time, then turned his back to it deliberately, the way Gideon had told him on the wagon road not to look back at Blackstone Ridge if you didn't have to. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. That question, practical, direct, ready, was enough to make her throat tighten in a way she didn't show. "Right now, go check on Thomas," she said. "He's upstairs being reasonable and hating it. He could use company." Caleb almost smiled. Then he went upstairs. Gideon looked at her across the kitchen. "You should have stayed on the porch," he said. "I know," she said. "That's all I'm going to say about it." "All right. I'm not saying it to criticize," he said. "I'm saying it because if you'd stayed on the porch, it would have been easier to control the situation, and what you actually did was harder and more dangerous, and worked." He paused. "Both things are true." "I know both things are true," she said. "I was there." He almost smiled. It looked painful with his face in its current state. Henry had fallen asleep against him, which was remarkable given the events of the afternoon, but entirely in character. "I'm going to need to send word to the deputy again," Gideon said. "And this time I need to put what happened today on paper in a way that creates a record. If Kane makes a legal move against the property, I want it established that he's been trespassing and threatening. Do you have documentation for the ranch? Deed, purchase records? Everything's in the strongbox under the floorboard in the back room." He looked at her. "You should know where that is. Everything's in it. Deed, cattle records, the registration with the Territorial Land Office, everything. She noted this. Not just the location, but the act of telling her. The shift it represented. We should make copies, she said. Send one set to the land office directly. Keep one set somewhere other than here. He looked at her. So that if something happens to the strongbox, she said, there's still a record. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about it since the first time he rode into the yard, she said. A man like Kane, the way he operates isn't just through force. He'd use legal machinery if he could find a way to. Property disputes, contested claims. You need the paper trail to be unassailable. Gideon studied her across the table. Franklin, he said, did he have land problems? No, but my father did. When I was 12, a neighbor disputed our boundary line, and we nearly lost the east pasture because we didn't have proper documentation, and he did. She sat down at the table. We won, eventually, but it took 2 years, and most of what my father had saved. I paid attention. I can see that, he said. The copies took 3 evenings to complete. Gideon's hand was better for it than hers, a firm, clear script that reproduced the records precisely. Abigail organized and indexed them, which was her strength, and Ruth helped with the indexing because Ruth had that kind of mind and was useless when she wasn't using it. They sent one complete set to the Territorial Land Office in a sealed envelope via the next supply rider who came through, and kept one set in the strongbox. And Abigail kept a third partial set, the deed and the registration, in her own locked case that she'd brought from Blackstone Ridge, which had survived the trip under the wagon seat. Gideon watched her lock the case and looked at her with an expression she'd started to recognize as the one he wore when he was surprised by her and was deciding whether to say so. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Just thinking you're more prepared than most people I've met. I've had to be, she said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I'm glad of it. Spring came in the way mountain springs do. Not gently, not all at once, but in a sustained argument with winter that winter eventually lost. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, and then from the valley floor, and then from everywhere except the north-facing hollows where it persisted in gray, stubborn patches well into April. The creek, freed from ice, ran loud and cold and clear, and the cattle that had spent winter in the lower pasture moved themselves toward the higher ground with the instinctive certainty of animals who know what they're doing. With spring came work of a different kind, calving, fence inspection across the entire property, the preparation of the kitchen garden that Abigail had claimed as her project and was approaching with the focused ambition of someone who has spent months eating preserved food and has opinions about it. The children integrated into this work with varying degrees of willingness and various natural aptitudes that the winter had already begun to reveal. Thomas was the ranch's best practical problem solver, which Gideon had recognized and begun to utilize in ways that Thomas found deeply satisfying. Ruth had turned out to have an unexpected facility with the cattle. She was calm around them, and they responded to that, and she could move a small group from one pasture to another with a competence that impressed even Gideon, who said so in the flat, factual way that made it mean more, coming from him, than from someone who handed out compliments freely. The twins were useful in short, concentrated bursts before their attention found other applications, which meant they were excellent for tasks with clear endpoints and less excellent for sustained projects. Caleb worked hard and consistently, but was still finding the shape of his authority in a household where he was no longer the only male of consequence. And this produced occasional friction that Abigail watched and waited on rather than intervening, because some things sorted themselves better without interference. May remained preoccupied with the chickens, which was producing measurable results. The flock was laying at a rate that Gideon said he hadn't seen since the previous owner had kept them, and May had opinions about the reasons for this that were occasionally correct. Henry, at 6, contributed primarily by being Henry, which the household had come to understand as a genuine contribution. He had a way of arriving at moments of tension and being so completely himself, interested, unguarded, requiring nothing more than presence, that the tension reconfigured itself around him. Gideon in particular seemed to find Henry's company restorative in some way he would never have described in those terms, but that was visible in how he settled when the boy was near. The first warm evening of April, with the kitchen garden's first beds turned and ready and the creek audible through the open window, Gideon and Abigail sat on the south porch after the children were in bed. They did this with increasing regularity, not by agreement, just by the accumulated habit of two people who had found that the end of the day was easier shared. Martha Keel says Ruth is working at a level she can't push further, Abigail said. She wants to recommend a correspondence school program. It means cost. That's fine, Gideon said. You haven't heard what it costs. It doesn't matter, he said. If she needs it, she gets it. Abigail looked at him. He was watching the valley, the mountains going purple in the evening light, the creek catching the last of the sun. You're not careful about money, she said. Not in the way I'd expect. I'm careful about what the money is for, he said. This is what it's for. He paused. I've been saving and accumulating out here for 12 years and spending on nothing. The account in Mill Haven has more in it than most people in this county will see in a lifetime of working. I didn't save it to sit in a bank. He glanced at her. Though I understand if that's strange to hear, given how I live. It's not strange, she said slowly. It's just different from what I expected. What did you expect? She thought about it honestly. Someone who was generous in a careful way, watching what it cost. I watch what things cost, he said. I just have a different list of what costs too much. She thought about that for a while. What's on your list? She asked. He was quiet for a long moment, in the particular way that meant he was actually considering the question rather than looking for an exit from it. Keeping things from people who need to know them, he said. Letting something go wrong because acting was inconvenient. Not saying what you mean until it's too late to say it. He paused. Those are the things that cost too much. She turned this over. Franklin was like that, she said. Not about money. About he didn't let things go unsaid, even the hard things. She looked at her hands in her lap. When he knew he was sick, he told me everything. The accounts, where the deed was, what the mule was actually borrowed for, and who I'd need to talk to about it. Things I didn't want to know and needed to know. She stopped. I was angry at him for it at the time. It felt like he was leaving me instead of fighting harder. He was making sure you had what you needed, Gideon said. I know that now. She looked at the valley. It took me a while to understand that saying the hard thing is its own kind of love. Some people can't do it. Gideon was quiet. Then, you said that to make a point. I said it because it's true, she said. Whether or not it makes a point. He looked at her. There's something I haven't said, he said. I know, she said. I've been waiting. He turned on the porch bench to face her more directly, which cost him something. His ribs were healing but not healed, and any rotation of his torso reminded him of this, and he seemed to decide the cost was acceptable. I should tell you why I was alone up here, he said. You've been living in my house for 3 months without knowing, and that's not right. You don't have to I know I don't have to, he said. That's not the reason I'm doing it. She waited. I was married, he said. 10 years ago, in Colorado Territory. Her name was Nora. We had a year together. He was looking at the mountains, not at her. There was a fever that came through the valley where we were living. It moved fast. She was gone in 8 days. He paused. I had a son. He was born 3 months after she died. He lived 2 days. He stopped, started again. I came north after that. I found this valley. I built this. He made a small, flat gesture that encompassed the ranch, the buildings, the accumulated work of 12 solitary years. I wasn't hiding, exactly. I just couldn't find a reason to be anywhere there were people. The porch was very quiet. Abigail did not say she was sorry, because sorry was not the right shape for something that big. She said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "What was she like?" He blinked. She could tell she'd surprised him, that it wasn't the response he'd prepared for. Funny, he said. Not joke funny, just she found things funny that other people missed, quietly. She'd say something dry in the middle of a serious situation, and you'd realize it 30 seconds later. He paused, and something in his face shifted briefly into something softer and much more painful. She would have liked your children, all of them. She would have had May's chickens named by the second day. Abigail felt something settle in her chest. Not grief for a woman she'd never known, but the weight of understanding what this man had been carrying for 12 years in a valley where there was no one to see him carry it. "Why are you telling me now?" she said. "Because you told me about Franklin," he said. "And because I've been watching you for 3 months. The way you managed this, the way you handled Kane, the way you are with your children." He looked at her directly. "You're not a temporary arrangement, Abigail. I don't think you ever were, even when we were both pretending that's what it was. And it felt dishonest to let you not know who you're actually here with." The creek moved steadily in the dark below the porch. "I know who I'm here with," she said. "I've been learning it for 3 months." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry about Nora, and about your son. That's a weight I wouldn't wish on anyone." "I know," he said. "It doesn't make me want to leave," she said. He looked at her. "I didn't think it would," he said. "That's not why I told you." "I know why you told me." They sat with the dark and the sound of the creek and the mountains holding still around the valley, the way they'd held still through everything else, patient and enormous and unmoved. "The deputy wrote back," Gideon said, after a while, returning to ground they both knew how to stand on. "He'll be in the county by the end of the month. I have the documentation ready." "Good." She paused. "And Kane? He's been quiet." Gideon's voice was factual. "Word travels in this territory. What happened in the yard? People heard. His second man talks, apparently. There are people who knew Kane was building towards something up here, and they know it didn't go the way he planned, and that changes how he looks to certain people whose opinion matters to him." "Pride," she said. "And reputation," he said. "He operates on the assumption that people believe he'll win. If that assumption weakens..." He left it there. "It won't be enough on its own," she said. "No, the deputy, the documentation, the record of what he's done, that's the longer work. But it helps." He looked at the valley. "He's not coming back soon. Maybe not at all. Men like Kane go where the resistance is lowest. We made the resistance too high." She thought about what he'd said, about the list of things that cost too much, about Nora and the son with no name and 12 years in this valley, about her own 11 months of scraping and managing and refusing to stop. Two people who'd survived things alone and were apparently better at most of this when they weren't. Inside the house, some night sound, probably Henry resettling in his sleep, moved through the building and then was quiet again. The windows were lit from within, warm against the dark. "I have something to tell you too," Abigail said. "I should have said it before." He waited. "When I was standing on that platform," she said, "before you stepped forward, I had a plan. It wasn't a good plan, but it was something. I was going to ask Prescott for more time, take the children east to my sister in Missouri, figure out the rest from there." She paused. "I wasn't waiting to be rescued. I want you to know that. I was already working the problem." "I know," he said. "I don't want you to think that what you did saved us," she said. "It changed things. It made things better. It gave us a better option, but we were going to be all right." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said again. "I could see that when I looked at you on that platform. That's partly why I stepped forward." She blinked. "What?" "A woman waiting to be saved looks different from a woman already working the problem," he said. "You were working the problem. I thought a person like that, with the children she's kept together through whatever she's been through, given a real option instead of a desperate one." He stopped. "I thought it seemed like something worth being part of." The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight and texture and the quality of something being understood between two people who had both been careful with their words for long enough that the honest ones arrived with particular force. "Well," Abigail said finally in the dry tone she used when something had moved her more than she wanted to show. "That's the most flattering thing anyone said to me in at least 3 years." The sound that came from Gideon Hale was something she hadn't heard from him before. Short, genuine, involuntary. A laugh. Brief and somewhat painful given his ribs, but real. She looked at him with surprise. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had just discovered something he'd forgotten he was capable of. "Good," he said. "You should hear it more often." The stars were coming out over the mountains. The creek ran its steady note. Inside the house, her children slept under a solid roof in a valley that held winter away and spring in with the same patient geography, and a man who had been alone for 12 years sat on a porch laughing carefully through cracked ribs. and Abigail Mercer sat beside him and looked at the mountains and felt something she recognized, distantly and with some surprise, as the particular quality of peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from knowing, with some confidence, that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. It was not certainty. She was not naive enough to call it that. But it was real, and it was hers, and she was not going to look away from it. The deputy arrived on a Thursday in late April, which was earlier than expected and arrived at a convenient moment. Convenient in the sense that Gideon had just finished organizing the documentation into a coherent sequence that told the story of Rufus Kane's conduct clearly and in the right order, and inconvenient in the sense that half the south fence was down for repair and the yard looked less like a functioning ranch and more like a construction site. Deputy Marshal Elias Cord was a lean, weathered man in his 50s who moved with the careful economy of someone who'd spent decades in difficult country and had learned to conserve everything. He came with a rider from Mill Haven who served as something between a witness and a courier, and he sat at the kitchen table and read through Gideon's documentation with the focused silence of a man who read a great deal and trusted what was written more than what was said to him. The children had been redistributed to various outdoor tasks by Abigail, with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage the social geometry of the house. Ruth had the younger ones in the kitchen garden, which was producing its first real growth and required weeding that Ruth supervised with the particular authority of a 12-year-old who has realized she is better at a thing than the people she is supervising. Thomas was at the fence with Caleb. The twins were theoretically helping Thomas and Caleb, but in practice were conducting independent operations in the general vicinity. May appeared in the kitchen doorway at one point during the deputy's visit, looked at the two men at the table, assessed the situation with 4-year-old directness, and said to Gideon, "Is that man going to fix the Kane problem?" "May," Abigail said, "I'm just asking." Deputy Cord looked up from the papers, and at May with an expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. "That's the intention, young lady." May considered this. "Good," she said, and left. Cord watched her go. "Yours?" he said to Abigail. "One of 7, she said. He looked at Gideon. Something moved through his expression. Recalibration, Abigail thought. The adjustment a man makes when he realizes a situation is different from what he'd been told to expect. "I heard about the arrangement," Cord said, returning to the papers. "From the county. I'll be honest, I had a picture in my head and it's not the picture I'm looking at." "What picture did you have?" Gideon asked. "Man taking on more than he could manage," Cord said plainly, "creating a situation Kane could use." He set the papers down. "That's not what this is." "No," Gideon agreed. "It isn't." Cord tapped the deed, the registration, the letters to the Territorial Land Office, the written account of Kane's 2 visits and what had occurred during them. The whole organized record of a property and a family that knew exactly what they had and had taken steps to protect it. "Kane's made moves before," Cord said. "Property disputes mostly. He works the edges. Never quite enough to bring full territorial authority down on him, always just inside the line of what can be proved. He knows the game." He paused. "This documentation changes the game. You've got the record clear enough that any move he makes on this property now, legal or otherwise, has context." He looked at Gideon. "The territorial judge at the spring circuit, he'll see this." "When's the circuit?" Abigail asked. 6 weeks, maybe 7. Cord looked at her. "You the one who confronted Kane in the yard?" "Yes," she said. "Both times?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with the same assessing quality he'd brought to the papers. Not skeptical, just thorough. "I'll need your account in writing," he said. "Separate from his. Same events, your perspective. Signed and dated." He paused. "It carries more weight with the judge coming from 2 people independently." "I'll write it today," she said. She did. She sat at the kitchen table after Cord and his rider had been fed and sent on their way toward the next property on his circuit, and she wrote 4 pages in her clean, deliberate hand, what Kane had said, what he'd implied, the specific language of his threats, the conduct of his companion on the second visit, what she had done, and why. She wrote it without embellishment and without minimizing, the way her father had taught her to write a record. What happened, in order, with the details that matter and nothing that doesn't. Gideon read it when she was done. "This is better than mine," he said. You were more focused on the property aspects, she said. The physical threats against people read differently in my account. Because you're the mother, he said. Because I was the one standing on the porch talking to him, she said. I remembered what he said word for word. Fear does that. He looked at her. You were afraid, he said. Not a question, not a judgment. Both times, she said. I was afraid the entire time, particularly the second time when I walked across the yard. She met his gaze. Being afraid and doing it anyway is all that's actually available. I don't know what courage is if it isn't that. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I just didn't. He stopped. You didn't think I was afraid, she said. You didn't look afraid. Gideon, she said, with a patience she usually reserved for the twins. If I'd looked afraid, it wouldn't have worked. He laughed again, the same short, reluctant sound she'd first heard on the porch, which she had decided she found genuinely worth producing. Fair point, he said. The weeks between Cord's visit and the territorial circuit were the most ordinary they'd had since arriving at the ranch, and Abigail later thought that ordinary was perhaps what she'd been most in need of without knowing it. Not the ordinary of Blackstone Ridge, which had been the grinding ordinary of not having enough. Not enough money, not enough help, not enough time before the county ran out of patience. This was a different kind, the ordinary of a household finding its shape, of work that accumulated into something rather than just sustaining you until the next hard thing. Spring proper arrived with the suddenness of a decision, the valley going from mud and gray snowmelt to green within the space of 2 weeks in a way that felt almost aggressive. The kitchen garden became Abigail's morning hour and her particular source of satisfaction, not because she was especially sentimental about gardens, but because it was hers, planned and planted according to her own judgment, producing visible results according to a logic she controlled. The first radishes came in on a Tuesday and were consumed at dinner with the disproportionate celebration of people who have eaten preserved food for 4 months. They're radishes, Thomas said, with the scrupulous honesty of a 9-year-old. There are radishes, May corrected him, with the same tone she used when explaining chicken dynamics to people who clearly didn't understand them. Thomas ate his radishes. The calving was long and hard, in the particular way that calving always is. 3 weeks of interrupted sleep and cold mornings, and the specific anxieties of new life that is small and fragile and doesn't always make it. They lost 2 calves in the first week, which Gideon took with the quiet stoicism of a man who'd done this before and knew better than to stop feeling it, but also knew the feeling wasn't useful, and he moved on. Thomas helped with 4 difficult deliveries, doing whatever Gideon told him with a steady-handed competence that drew a comment from Gideon one evening that Thomas held privately for a long time after. You have good hands and you don't panic. That's most of what matters in this work. Caleb, who had spent the winter uncertain of his place in the altered landscape of the household, found it gradually in spring through the fence work. It was his and Gideon's project specifically, the long circuit of the property's boundary fencing, post by post, mile by mile, and it took most of April and into May. There was something in the sustained, physical, demanding sameness of it that suited Caleb in a way more varied work didn't, and there was something in Gideon's style of working alongside someone, present but not hovering, expecting competence and getting it, talking when there was something to say and not otherwise, that gave Caleb room to find the shape of himself without the pressure of being observed too closely. One afternoon, in the 3rd week of fence work, they were pulling an old post that had rotted at the base, and it was being stubborn, and Caleb was putting his full weight into it with limited effect. And Gideon said, without looking up from what he was doing with the wire, "Your mother told you she had a plan. On the platform." Caleb stopped pulling. "A backup plan," he said carefully, in case no one stepped forward. "Did you know?" "No." He started working the post again. "She didn't tell us much about how bad it was. I knew it was bad. I didn't know—" He stopped. "She didn't want us to be more scared than we already were." Gideon got his hands under the post and pulled with Caleb, and between them it came up in a spray of rotted wood and cold dirt. "She was protecting you," Gideon said. "She always was," Caleb said. "She's always been the one—" He stopped again, with the arrested quality of someone saying more than they'd intended. Then he finished it anyway. She's always been the one between us and whatever was coming, since my father died, even before. She just always, she stands between. Gideon set the old post aside and started positioning the new one. I know, he said. She'd hate hearing that, Caleb said. She'd say she's not protecting anyone, she's just handling things. Probably the same thing, Gideon said. Caleb helped him hold the new post while Gideon tamped the dirt around it, the work moving forward the way it always did. Can I ask you something? Caleb said. You can ask, Gideon said. Which was the answer Caleb had come to understand meant yes with the option to decline if it was the wrong question. Did you know what you were doing? Caleb said. When you stepped forward, did you know what it was going to be like? Gideon thought about that with the particular deliberateness he brought to questions that deserved it. I knew it would be complicated, he said. I knew I was taking on a lot. I didn't know you specifically, any of you. I didn't know what the particular complications would be. Do you regret it? The question sat in the air between them for a moment, in the way that honest questions sit when the person asking them is genuinely waiting rather than looking for reassurance. No, Gideon said, flat and final in the way he said things he'd decided about. Not for a single day. Caleb nodded. He held the post and let that be enough. The circuit judge arrived in Mill Haven on a Tuesday in early June, which meant the hearing was set for Wednesday, which meant the day before was spent in preparation of a kind Abigail had done before in different circumstances and did not love. Organizing papers, anticipating questions, thinking through the ways things could go sideways and what to do if they did. Gideon rode to Mill Haven with the documentation. Abigail stayed with the children because someone had to, and because her written account had already been submitted and her physical presence at the hearing was not required, and because she had learned, was still learning, the particular discipline of not needing to be in the room where things were decided. It had taken her years to understand that this was not powerlessness. She had done her part. The preparation was hers. The record was hers. What happened in the room would happen based on what she had already done, and worrying at it from 30 miles away would not change the outcome. She spent the day in the garden and managed the children's schoolwork with Martha Keel, who had extended her visits to 2 days a week through spring and had developed what appeared to be a genuine affection for the Mercer children as a collective project, and who sat at the kitchen table with Ruth on Wednesday afternoon working through a mathematics problem that Ruth kept insisting was wrong, despite getting the right answer. The answer's correct, Martha said patiently. But the method doesn't make sense, Ruth said. The method is standard. That doesn't mean it makes sense. Martha looked at Abigail over Ruth's head with the expression of a woman who was being paid a fair wage and was earning it. Abigail found this funny. She didn't say so, because it would have encouraged Ruth, who did not need encouragement in this particular direction. Gideon came back the following evening, later than expected, which meant the extra hours before his horse appeared on the valley road were the kind of hours that stretch. She was on the porch when he rode in, which was not unusual. She'd been on the porch for an hour, which was... He tied the horse and came up to the porch and sat down on the bench beside her, and she could tell from the way he moved, not the particular carefulness of his healing ribs, which were mostly done now, but something different, a quality of release, before he said anything. It's done, he said. Tell me. He told her. The hearing had gone as well as documentation and preparation could make a thing go. The judge had reviewed the records, heard Cord's account and Gideon's testimony, and issued a formal trespass and harassment finding against Rufus Kane covering the incidents in February and March. More importantly, the judge had registered a legal notation in the territorial property record confirming Gideon's ownership and the integrity of his boundary lines, which was the tool that mattered, the thing that made any future attempt by Kane to dispute the property legally into an uphill battle he was unlikely to win. Kane himself had not appeared at the hearing. Whether he'd been notified and chose not to come or hadn't been found was unclear. His absence from the hearing, Cord had told Gideon, was itself a kind of statement. A man who knew the documentation was solid and had decided not to test it in front of a judge. Cord thinks he'll move on, Gideon said. Find something easier somewhere else. What do you think? Abigail asked. I think Cord is probably right. Men like Kane are opportunists. They go where the opportunity is. We've made this one too expensive. He looked at the valley. I won't assume it's over, but I think it is. She thought about this. The fence is in good shape, she said. The documentation is filed. The judge has the record. What else can we do? Nothing more than we're already doing, he said, which is the answer I can live with. She could live with it too. That evening, after dinner, Gideon told the children what had happened in terms that were appropriate to their different ages and understanding. He was better at this than she would have predicted in January. The calibration of information, the particular way he looked at each child when he spoke to them directly, as though they were the only person in the room and the subject was of real consequence, which to each of them it was. The twins wanted to know if Cain was going to be put in jail, and Gideon explained that it didn't quite work that way, which disappointed them. Thomas wanted to know about the legal mechanism of the property notation, and Gideon explained it accurately and in detail, and Thomas nodded with the expression of someone filing it carefully. Caleb said nothing, but his shoulders came down from where they'd been living for the past several weeks. Ruth said, "So we're safe here?" "Yes," Gideon said. Ruth looked at him for a moment with her particular 12-year-old assessment that he'd long since stopped being thrown by. "You're sure?" she said. "I'm sure," he said. "The legal record protects the property, and anyone who comes onto this land with bad intentions is going to find the same thing they found in March." He held her gaze. "We're not easy targets. We've established that." Ruth nodded. Then she looked at Abigail with an expression that was complicated, relief, and something more private. Something that acknowledged the months of carrying the knowledge of Cain as a weight without showing it to the younger children. "Okay," Ruth said. And then, because Ruth could not leave a conversation without one more pass at it, "I still think the property notation should have been established from the beginning. It seems like the kind of thing the territorial system should require, rather than leaving to individual initiative." "You're right," Gideon said. Ruth blinked. She was not entirely accustomed to being agreed with immediately. "Oh," she said. "The system has gaps," he said. "People who know the gaps use them. People who don't, learn." He looked at her steadily. "You'd make a good lawyer if that's ever a direction you want to go." The dinner table went quiet for a moment in the way it does when something true is said that lands differently from regular conversation. Ruth looked at her plate. Her ears were pink. "Maybe," she said, with enormous casualness. Abigail caught Gideon's eye across the table and looked away before either of them showed anything, because Ruth's dignity in this moment was worth protecting. "What?" Summer came and made itself at home in the valley with the confidence of something that knew it was wanted. The garden produced with a generosity that Abigail found almost embarrassing. More zucchini than any reasonable household required, beans in profusion, tomatoes that took their time but arrived eventually in quantities that meant 2 days of canning in August that left the kitchen hot and smelling of vinegar and produced rows of jars on the cellar shelf that were, Abigail thought, one of the more satisfying things she'd looked at in recent memory. The ranch found its summer rhythm. Gideon and Caleb and Thomas managed the cattle work. Ruth had taken over primary responsibility for the chickens from May, not because May had lost interest, but because May's interest had matured into something closer to consulting work. She visited the flock daily and provided assessments, but Ruth handled the actual operations. The twins had been given the fence-checking circuit on the south and east pastures as their designated task, which suited them because it involved horses and outdoor movement and no sustained requirement to be in one place doing one thing. Henry, who was 6 going on 7 and increasingly aware that everyone else had something that was theirs, had appointed himself keeper of the water troughs, a task he performed with such focused dedication that the troughs were the cleanest they'd been in years. There were hard days. There were days when the work didn't go right and the weather was wrong and something needed fixing that they didn't have the parts for. And one of the twins said something to the other that escalated into a fight that required Abigail to intervene and Gideon to spend 20 minutes in separate conversations with each of them in which he was patient in a way that cost him something and didn't take any shortcuts. There were days when the weight of what the past year had been sat on Abigail in ways she didn't show, when she missed Franklin with a specificity that surprised her, not the general missing of grief but particular things, the sound of his voice reading aloud, the way he made coffee. She let herself feel those things when they came and didn't apologize for them to herself or to anyone else, and they passed the way things pass when you don't fight them. There was an evening in July when she and Gideon argued. It was about the cattle record, specifically about a discrepancy between his accounting method and hers, each of which was internally consistent and mutually incompatible, and which had produced two different numbers for the same herd and therefore needed to be resolved. The argument started as a practical disagreement and remained one longer than it needed to, and Abigail said something sharper than she'd intended, and Gideon said something shorter than he meant, and they both went quiet. And then they spent 20 minutes working through the actual numbers in silence until the discrepancy was found, and it was nobody's method that was wrong, but a transcription error from 2 months back. Your method, Gideon said at the end of this, is more systematic. Your method, Abigail said, accounts for seasonal variance better. We should use both, he said. That's what I was going to suggest, she said. There was a pause. I was sharp, she said. I was short, he said. Neither of them said sorry in an excessive way, because they were both people who understood that sorry was most meaningful when it was precise and didn't require elaborate staging. They just moved on, which was its own kind of apology and its own kind of respect. She thought afterward that this was perhaps what she hadn't expected and should have. Not that things would be easy, not that they would agree on everything or move through life without friction, but that the friction, when it came, would be worked through rather than around. That both of them were people who preferred the harder honest path to the easier dishonest one, and that this preference, which could produce arguments, was also the reason they could trust each other. It was not a small thing to trust the person you'd built your life alongside. She had learned that it could not be assumed or declared. It had to be demonstrated repeatedly in the small ordinary ways and the large difficult ones, until the accumulation of demonstrations became something structural rather than just occasional. On a late August evening, with the days beginning to shorten and the first hint of something cooler in the air off the mountains, Abigail sat on the south porch in the last of the light and let herself look at what the year had produced. The valley spread below her, green and gold in August's particular light. The barn was solid, the fences tight, the cattle moving in the upper pasture with the unhurried confidence of animals that had eaten well all summer and knew where they were. The house behind her was full of sounds. Thomas and Caleb in a low discussion about something, the twins' feet on the stairs, May's voice explaining something to Henry in the patient tone she used when she was being the authority on a subject, Ruth somewhere in the back of the house, probably reading. A household doing what households do at the end of a day. The machinery of ordinary life moving forward on its own power. Gideon came out and sat beside her. For a while they just looked at the valley together. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask, he said. When we first came, she said, when we drove into the valley and you showed me the house, you said it would be different. I remember. Did you know how different? He was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. I thought I was bringing order to a situation that needed it. I thought I was being practical. He looked at the valley. I didn't expect to feel the way I feel about it. About them. About you. He said it plainly, the way he said hard things when he decided to say them without decoration. I didn't think I was still capable of that. She looked at him. You thought you'd used it all up, she said. On Nora. Something like that. Feelings don't work that way, she said. I know it can feel like they do. After Franklin, I thought... She stopped, started again. I thought the part of me that could open a door for someone new was just gone. Grief does that. It makes the walls seem permanent. She paused. But walls aren't the same as foundations. The foundation was still there. I just couldn't see it until there was something worth seeing. He looked at her. Is that what I am? He said. Something worth seeing? You're annoying about the cattle records, she said. He laughed. The full version now, not the suppressed one, though it still had a quality of surprise in it, like laughter was something he was perpetually discovering he was still able to do. And the fence posts, she said. You have opinions about fence posts that I find excessive. Fence posts matter, he said. I know they matter, Gideon. I've listened to a great deal about fence posts. He was still smiling, and she was. And the evening light was doing something particular on the mountains, turning the snowfields at the peaks a color between pink and gold. And she thought, this is what people mean when they talk about a life. Not the clean version of it. Not the version where everything works the first time and the roads are clear and the people you love don't die and the bad men stay away. The real version, which is harder and less certain and also, under the right circumstances with the right people, in a place that lets you put something down and build something up. Genuinely and stubbornly good. She had been told, in various ways and by various people, that she was too much. Too many children, too many complications, too much weight for any decent man to want to take on. She had been put on a platform in January and found wanting by men who weighed her against what she would cost them and found the arithmetic unworkable. What she knew now, 8 months from that platform, was that those men had been solving the wrong problem. They'd been calculating the cost of what she carried without accounting for what she was. And the cost of what she carried, distributed across a working ranch, with enough land and enough hands and one man who had looked at her and seen someone already working the problem rather than waiting to be saved, the cost turned out to be manageable. More than manageable. The cost turned out to be worth it. Not because it had been easy. Nothing about this year had been easy. From the blizzard on the road to cane in the yard, to the slow, grinding work of 7 children and 2 adults who hadn't known each other in January, learning to be a household in the months that followed. It had been hard in ways she was still processing and in ways she suspected she'd be processing for years. Some of what had been lost was not recoverable. Franklin was not coming back. The easy years she'd imagined before grief taught her what life actually required were not coming back either. But here was what was true. Her children were safe and fed and learning, and Ruth might be a lawyer someday, and Thomas was becoming someone who knew how to work alongside another person without losing himself. And Caleb was learning to be young again after a year of being too old. And the twins were the twins and probably always would be. And Henry still fell asleep on whoever was nearest, and nobody had once suggested this was a problem. And Abigail herself was sitting on a porch in a valley that nobody had handed her, that she had arrived at through a sequence of losses and decisions and one cold morning on a platform where she had stood straight and not looked away. And she was looking at a life that was hers in a way that the life in Blackstone Ridge, for all its familiarity, had never quite been. That was the thing nobody told you about starting over. Not the hard part. Everyone told you about the hard part. The thing nobody told you was that starting over, done honestly and with your eyes open and with people who actually see you, could produce something more solid than what you'd had before. Not better, in the simple sense. Franklin had been good and his loss was real and she would not minimize it. But different. Built from different materials, in a different place, by people who knew more about what they were building and why. A thing you chose every day with full knowledge of the cost, which made it yours in a way that things you were simply born into could never quite be. Gideon's hand found hers on the bench between them, not reaching, not demonstrating, just resting there, as though it had found the place it was supposed to be and had no further comment on the matter. She turned her hand and held his. The valley held its long evening quiet. The mountains kept their old counsel. The creek ran on, steady and cold and clear, indifferent to what had happened along its banks and carrying it all south just the same. The hard winter and the blizzard on the road and the man in the yard and the documentation and the judge and the ordinary days that had made themselves into something extraordinary simply by accumulating, all of it moving away, downstream, into wherever the past goes when the present is solid enough to hold you. Inside the house, one of the twins called the other's name. A door opened somewhere. May's voice rose briefly and subsided. The sounds of people who knew where they were and expected to be there tomorrow. Henry appeared in the doorway behind them and stood looking out at the evening with his characteristic expression of mild, interested contentment. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "The mountains," Abigail said. Henry came and wedged himself between them on the bench, which was not quite wide enough for this, but which accommodated it anyway, and looked at the mountains with them. "They're big," he said with the tone of someone making a contribution to an ongoing discussion. "Yes," Gideon said. "They are." Henry nodded, satisfied. He leaned against Gideon's arm and looked at the big mountains in the evening light, and Gideon let him, and the 3 of them sat there while the sky went from gold to purple to the first deep blue of a clear summer night. It was not a perfect life. It was not the life any of them had planned. It was the life they had made with what they'd been given and what they'd chosen and what they'd survived, and it was real, and it was theirs, and it was enough, more than enough. It was home.